Whoever controls the media controls the mind. Morrison's quotation perfectly describes the Roaring Twenties. During this time there was the Great War, the influenza, and the beginning of the Depression. There was one force keeping hope for Americans alive, and it wasn't the government, it was entertainers. And radio were the perfect forms of escapism from modern-day life. Like the heroes in silent films, Americans had learned to overcome their struggles with humor. Americans could forget the Great War for a few minutes to laugh at Buster Keaton nearly being crushed by a house in Steamboat Bill Jr. Audiences could temporarily not let the influenza ruin their mood by seeing Little Tramp roller skating close to a ledge while blindfolded in modern times. If film and radio heroes could pick themselves up after defeat, so could a modern American. Radio was more easily available to the average American consumer. Instead of taking a trip to the theater, one would take a trip to the living room. Between 1923 and 1930, 60% of American families had owned radios, and for good reason. Radio shows would always broadcast at a certain time, giving a reason for families to always schedule a time to listen, and there would always be a time of the day made for bringing the family together. Since the radio is popular around the country, different families could all feel a certain unity to each other, but radio could also carry negative messages. The most popular show was Amos and Andy, and supported many negative black stereotypes. Fortunately, radio did bring support to black culture. Black musicians could send their voice around the country through the language of jazz. Radio is also the closest thing to live news. The news broadcasts in movie theaters were not always current to the hour. Radio also strengthened America's spirit for mystery and adventure. Since there was no video feed, eager listeners would have to imagine the Lone Ranger and Tonto chasing after bad guys on their noble steeds. No, not that Lone Ranger! But similar to today's films, radio had a collection of fictional stories, news, music, theater, and tons of faithful fans. But what of the films of the Roaring Twenties? Not too different from today, film audiences would believe the themes of film should reflect real life. Films would sell the sex appeal, and the like of Greta Garbo's films, and make viewers believe it was alright to treat women as sex objects, but that was only the beginning. As expected, cultural stereotypes didn't end with the radio. The 1915 big-budget hokum known as Birth of a Nation led many to believe that the KKK's job was an admirable one, and that killing innocent black men was the Klan's duty. Although the film was looked down upon today, its impact on history is so important that it still holds the number 44 spot on the list of the American Film Institute's top 100 films. Also on the American Film Institute's top 100 films is The Jazz Singer, which was the first talkie, meaning it was more than just a piano playing in the background as for sound. It had real dialogue, and even though it did have a Jewish character as the main star, he did make money by being in blackface in minstrel shows. Just as film's altered portrayal of the real world created false ideas about society, it also kept the country's morale up. Early comedians didn't have the benefit of sound, but that didn't stop them. Their energy was so high it spoke the words that they couldn't. It was the kind of high energy that people needed. Silent comedians such as Chaplin or Keaton would constantly lighten the atmosphere and bring hope to the audience members. Similarly, adventure serials would spark Americans' interest to go exploring, and fantasy ones would let them visualize their own imaginations, such as Flash Gordon. Part of this came from the fact that the average American would see a movie once a week. A good place to see these movies would be at theaters that only cost a nickel, or Nickelodeons. No, not that Nickelodeon! Although radio and film were not strangers to promoting negative stereotypes, whether it be based on race, gender, or something else entirely, they should be seen more for their merits. The merits consist of how Americans could strengthen their imaginations, attitudes, and have a set family time, thus improving the society as a whole.